Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into this.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting piece by Ralph D. Winter.
Yeah.
And it was originally presented by the Frontier Mission Fellowship.
Mm.
And I thought, you know what, we should do this deep dive on this because it's a
Yeah.
really thought-provoking piece.
Absolutely.
And the question that Winter poses is, are we, particularly those of us, living in the West, truly ready for what the future of Christian faith might look like as it, continues to evolve globally? And
Right.
this touches on some really interesting points about how faith and culture
Yeah.
are, intertwined
Right.
and what we consider to be, truly essential to the faith.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
And you shared this with me. I thought it would be great to get your take on it as well.
I'm excited to talk about it with you because Winter,
Okay.
he's such a key figure, I think, in missions and missiology. And so to be able to look at one of his pieces and kind of dig into it will be really beneficial for our listeners.
Yeah. And he has, all this experience to back up his perspective.
Yes.
He spent a decade as a missionary among the Mayan Indians in Guatemala. And then, after that, he went on to, be involved in mission education and founded mission organizations.
Yeah. He's a founder of the U.S. Center for World Mission and William Carey International University.
Right.
So he's really spent his life thinking about and working on this issue of mission.
Yeah. So he's coming from a place of,
Yes, they're very much
experience and deep thought about all of this.
Absolutely.
And he starts the piece with this anecdote about a Jewish rabbi in Los Angeles who believes that Orthodox Judaism is the only genuine form of the faith.
Right.
And this rabbi views other Jewish congregations
That's having become too Christian.
Right. And so it's this question of what is the original or authentic version of a faith?
Right.
And how much does culture inevitably shape its expression?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And that's what Winter's trying to get us to think about here.
Absolutely. And I think that's what he uses the anecdote to do, is just immediately highlight the way that we as humans tend to think, which is we tend to equate a particular historical or cultural expression of a faith with the essence of that faith.
Right.
And that's what this rabbi in LA is doing.
Yeah.
He's saying, well, true Judaism is Orthodox Judaism. It's the pure form, the untainted form. And Winter's challenging that very notion and saying, no, that's not how we should be thinking about it.
Yeah.
We shouldn't think that there's only one true culture that can support true faith.
Right.
That's the idea that he's going to dig into here.
Right. And so let's dig deeper into this idea of fixed true culture.
Okay.
Winter quickly points out that even within Judaism itself, Orthodox practice represents just one part of the global religious spectrum.
Right.
And he uses these really relatable examples like the Roman tradition of throwing rice at weddings.
Right.
Or the pagan roots of December 25th, that comes from the Roman Saturnalia.
Yeah.
And he asks, should these kind of cultural practices be adopted by faiths in completely different cultural contexts?
Exactly. And I think it forces us to consider what is a core belief versus what's cultural custom.
Right.
And what we might view as totally essential to our faith, like celebrating Christmas on December 25th.
Right.
If we really trace it back, historically, it's got these pagan associations. That's one of the reasons why Winter mentions that early Greek Christians didn't even celebrate Jesus's birth on December 25th because of those associations.
Right.
And so it really highlights how intertwined even core practices can become with the surrounding culture.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Winter highlights the irony that modern Jewish orthodoxy isn't some static, unchanged entity. It has evolved over centuries, incorporating additions and modifications that came long after, those early periods of Hebrew culture.
Right.
David's time.
Right.
Moses' time, even Abraham's time.
Absolutely.
And he makes this crucial observation that even the Jewish Bible itself doesn't present a picture of a single unchanging cultural way of life.
Yeah. And I think this is such a key point because so often we want to look at the Bible and say, well, it's very clear that we're supposed to do things this way and live this way. And we ignore the fact that the scriptures themselves are a product of diverse historical and cultural settings.
Right.
And so to try and solidify one particular cultural manifestation as the only legitimate one
Right.
overlooks that dynamic relationship between faith and human societies across time.
Right.
It's like trying to freeze frame a river
Yeah.
and say, well, this one image is the entirety of the river.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
It doesn't capture the whole thing.
And that leads us really nicely into Winter's next argument about God's pattern of cultural displacement. He looks at, the big picture of biblical history and sees this recurring theme of God seemingly, moving people out of their comfort zones, out of familiar cultural settings.
Oh, right.
Think about Abraham's journeys, the scattering of the tribes of Israel, the exile of the Judeans.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like God is constantly pushing people out of their cultural nests.
What's fascinating to me is how he interprets that.
Right.
I think a lot of us would say, well,
Right.
God is trying to preserve his people and preserve their faith within a certain culture.
Right.
Winter suggests maybe it's not just about preserving it within a specific culture, especially when that culture becomes resistant to the core message of that faith.
Yeah.
Maybe he's actually preparing people to carry their faith across cultural boundaries, to learn to adapt and express their beliefs in new and diverse contexts.
Yeah, and he goes even further, asserting that the Bible as a whole seems to offer a critique of all human cultural traditions.
That's right.
Regardless of their origin.
Yeah.
Whether they're Abrahamic, Mosaic, Greek-influenced, any other, it's as if no cultural expression of faith gets a complete endorsement.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
I think that should really humble us as Christians.
Right.
Because often, I think, particularly in the West, we can get this idea that our culture is somehow superior to other cultures.
Right.
But the Bible really doesn't give us any basis for that.
Yeah.
If anything, all human cultures are subject to scrutiny and critique from a biblical perspective.
Right.
So we need to be really cautious about equating our own cultural norms and practices with the very essence of our beliefs.
Exactly.
And, that kind of leads into the next question that Winter poses, which I think is a little bit uncomfortable for us to ask.
Right. He poses this question directly. He says, is God's culture simply equivalent to evangelical American pop culture? It's complete with, its CDs and DVDs and television.
Yeah.
And he doesn't shy away from it. It's horrifying divorce rate.
Right, right. He lists all these elements, and, it makes us wonder, why is he listing them?
Right.
What is he getting at?
Right. And what is he saying about those things?
Yeah. Is he condemning them outright?
Yeah.
Is he saying they're bad?
Yeah.
I think his point is not necessarily a condemnation, but rather a challenge to whether they represent the core of Christian faith.
Right.
And whether they are universally applicable or even helpful in other cultural contexts.
Right.
He's really questioning, I think, whether our presentation of Christianity in the West has become so intertwined with these specific cultural trappings that we risk exporting the culture more than the core message of the faith itself.
Right.
It's like, are we giving people Jesus wrapped in an American flag?
Right.
Or are we giving them Jesus?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah. And the follow-up question he raises is even more pointed.
Yeah.
Are our missionaries, perhaps unintentionally, promoting this specific cultural package when they go out into the world?
Yeah, I think this is a huge question for us to grapple with.
Yeah.
Because what are we actually exporting?
Right.
Are we exporting faith itself?
Right.
Or are we exporting a cultural system dressed up as faith?
Right.
And I think, the answer is probably
a little bit of both.
Yeah, a little bit of both.
And that's something that we need to be really careful about.
Yeah, I think this gets at the heart of cultural imperialism that can happen with missions.
Right.
Are we inadvertently creating cultural replicas of Western Christianity?
Yeah.
Or are we fostering truly indigenous expressions of faith that resonate authentically within their own cultural frameworks?
Yeah, and then he says, what will the future of Christianity look like as it continues to spread and take root in diverse societies?
Yeah.
And so, having seen how deeply culture can be intertwined with our understanding of faith, Winter then turns his attention to where the most significant growth in biblical faith is actually happening.
Right.
often outside these familiar Western structures.
Yeah. And that's what he calls the unseen growth.
Right.
That's occurring outside the boundaries of what we would consider traditional Western Christianity.
Right. He says the most significant expansion of biblical faith isn't taking place within the denominations we're most familiar with. You know,
Orthodox,
Catholic,
Protestant,
Pentecostal,
charismatic, all of those.
yeah, all the ones we know.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's already a thought-provoking statement because we tend to look at those denominations and think, well, that's where Christianity is.
Yeah.
That's where it's growing.
Right.
But Winter says no.
Yeah.
That's not actually where the most significant growth is happening.
Yeah.
And so he points to these movements that often go unnoticed by Western Christian observers.
Yeah.
He specifically highlights the 50 million people within the African-initiated churches.
Yeah, that fascinating movements.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times we in the West would look at them and say, well, they're not really Christian.
Right.
But Winter says, no, they're using the Bible. We're following Jesus.
Right.
They're just doing it in a way that's very distinct from our traditional Western denominations.
Yeah, and that's okay.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
In fact, he says it's actually a good thing because it shows that the faith is able to take root in different cultural contexts.
And then he mentions the millions arising within the Indian caste system among populations where traditional Western-style Christianity has had a limited presence.
Yeah.
And
that's another example of people finding their own ways to connect with biblical teachings within their own unique social and cultural context.
Yeah, and the house church movement in China is another critical example. While those of us in the West might readily categorize that as Christian, Winter suggests that upon closer examination, it might not neatly fit into our established Western categories and understandings of what constitutes a church or a Christian practice.
We might look at some of the things that they do and say, well, that doesn't look like Christianity to me. And Winter would say, well, why not?
Right.
What is your definition of Christianity? Is it simply what you're used to seeing in the West?
Right.
Or is it something bigger than that?
Yeah. And he points to things like the structure of leadership, the forms of worship, and even the interpretation of Scripture, which might be influenced by their specific cultural background and their experiences operating outside of officially sanctioned religious structures.
Absolutely.
And so then he makes this really insightful observation about why Western Christianity has historically found more acceptance among minority groups around the world.
Yes.
Those who perhaps had less to lose by adopting a foreign culture because they were already marginalized within their own dominant cultures.
Yes.
And he uses India, China, and parts of Africa as examples.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because it challenges that simple narrative that a lot of us have grown up with of Western Christianity just kind of expanding across the globe and everyone's embracing it.
Yeah.
And what Winter suggests is that it's a more complex interaction that's happening.
Yeah.
Often those who are on the fringes of society are the ones who find resonance with a faith that offers an alternative to their existing social frameworks.
And so then Winter offers this prediction that you might find surprising.
Okay.
He says that future growth in biblical faith globally might increasingly appear cultic or anomalous from a Western perspective.
Yeah, that's a really provocative thought.
Yeah.
It compels us to really examine our own definitions and boundaries of what we consider legitimate expressions of faith.
Right. And so if we are seeing these divergent forms emerging across the globe, Winter poses some really crucial questions.
Yeah.
He asks, are we in the West truly prepared for these homegrown, potentially unconventional expressions of biblical faith?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Are we open to that? Or are we going to say, no, that's not real Christianity.
Right.
That's something else.
Does our attitude towards similar movements within our own Western context align with what's needed in other parts of the world?
Yeah. Do we have a double standard?
Right.
Are we willing to accept diversity of expression in other parts of the world, but not in our own backyard?
Right.
That's something we have to wrestle with.
These are really critical questions that force us to confront our own biases and assumptions. Are we willing to recognize and validate forms of faith that don't mirror our own cultural expressions and historical traditions?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And are we willing to accept that God might be working in ways that we don't fully understand or agree with?
And Winter raises this important point about trust. Can we ultimately trust the Bible itself to provide a corrective or balancing influence on these new and evolving movements?
That's the key, I think. Because if we don't trust the Bible, then we're left with just our own opinions and preferences. And that's a pretty shaky foundation.
And then he introduces this really thought-provoking comparison between Islam and Roman Catholicism. He points out that both contain elements
that we would consider.
That many in the West might view as non-Christian.
Non-Christian. And often criticize, there are things in Islam and there are things in Roman Catholicism
that, if we're honest, we have to say those are not Christian. Those are from other religions. But Winter's point is that Islam, unlike, say, Hindu culture, clearly has significant roots in the biblical narrative and tradition. Muhammad saw himself as a prophet in the line of the biblical prophets. He claimed to be restoring the true faith of Abraham. And so Winter's saying, look, we can't just dismiss Islam as a completely foreign religion. It has connections to the Bible.
It's interesting because it makes you reconsider how we categorize and understand different faith traditions in relation to one another.
And how much are we influenced by our own prejudices and biases when we're making those judgments?
And Winter's not necessarily endorsing everything within Islam or Roman Catholicism. But he's highlighting this undeniable influence of biblical ideas.
Even in traditions that have diverged significantly from what we might consider mainstream Western Christianity.
I think he's trying to get us to see the complex and often unexpected ways in which religious ideas spread and adapt and interact across different cultures. It's not a simple story.
It's not a simple story.
It's not just Christianity going out from the West and taking over the world. It's a much more complicated story.
And so the central question becomes, how should we approach these quasi-biblical forms of faith that are emerging and evolving around the world?
What do we do with them? How do we relate to them?
And Winter ultimately suggests a fundamental shift in our focus. Instead of getting bogged down in the seemingly endless variety of earthen vessels, the diverse cultural forms that faith takes, he urges us to concentrate on something far more fundamental. The degree to which God's will is taking hold in those contexts. And that, for him, is the very essence of the kingdom of God.
And that's a great point, I think, because it helps us to move beyond just the external forms of religion and to focus on the heart of the matter, which is what God is doing in the world.
It's a really powerful concluding thought by shifting our perspective away from the external cultural expressions and towards the deeper question of God's will being realized. We gain a more universal and less culturally restricted understanding of the growth and impact of faith on a global scale.
I think so too.
And so to really give you something to reflect on, let's revisit those study questions that Winter himself posed. First, why is it difficult for us to objectively evaluate our own cultural expressions of Christianity?
Why is it so hard for us to step back and look at our own faith with a critical eye? Why are we so quick to defend it and to justify it?
And second, what influence can we expect to correct or bring balance to forms of Christian faith that might seem errant or misdirected?
So if we see something that we think is wrong, how do we address that? How do we correct it?
And those are really powerful questions to sit with.
They are a lot to chew on there.
A lot to chew on there. And this is a final thought for you. Consider this. How might recognizing the inherent cultural fluidity of faith fundamentally reshape our understanding of religious identity and the way spiritual ideas actually spread throughout the world?
I think that's a huge question for us to be thinking about because I think it can really change the way we view other religions and the way we approach missions.
What might we learn if we focus less on the specific packaging of faith and more on its actual impact and its ongoing adaptation in all of its remarkably diverse contexts.
That's a great place to leave it, I think.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.